This is one in a series of podcasts as part of our AHRC-funded project on Kleist, education and violence. And with me is Dr. Sean Allen from the University of Warwick, and I'm Ricarda Schmidt, University of Exeter. Today we will be discussing Kleist's story Michael Kohlhaas. An initial fragment was published in the June edition of Kleist's journal Phoebus in 1808, and the first full publication appeared in the volume of his Erzählungen, his stories, in 1810. The conception is thought to date back to Kleist's time in Königsberg in 1805-6. The story is perhaps Kleist's most famous prose work. It belongs to the canon of both German and world literature. It is a work which continues to fascinate and trouble readers to the present day. Sean, could you perhaps give a brief overview of the plot?
Basically, the novella tells the story of Michael Kohlhaas, a 16th century horse trader, who, when he's denied justice, decides to take the law into his own hands. He's forced to hand over some of his horses by way of a surety at a recently established toll gate, and when he returns to collect his 2 black horses from the Junker's estate, he finds that they've been maltreated. All his efforts to seek financial compensation via the regular legal channels come to nothing, and when his wife, Lisbeth, goes in person to present his petition to the local governor, she becomes involved in a fatal accident. And I think this marks effectively the turning point in the novella, because it prompts Kohlhaas to ever despair of ever achieving justice through the courts. And as a result, he assembles a group of men and takes the law into his own hands, pursuing his enemy, the Junker, throughout Saxony and demanding that he be handed over to him by those offering him shelter. And it's only really when the Protestant reformer Martin Luther intervenes that Kohlhaas agrees to an amnesty and lays down his weapons and refers his case to the courts once again. But what he discovers is that he's been tricked by the administration in Saxony and he's condemned to a humiliating death. But there's another twist to the story, because his case is reopened by the Elector of Brandenburg, and that leads to the restitution of his horses. Nonetheless, this quest for justice comes at a price, because at the end of the story, Kohlhaas is condemned to death for his earlier acts of insurrection. And I think the question of just how we're to evaluate that ending, and the central character, Kohlhaas himself, these are issues that I think Kleist's readers have grappled with ever since the story was first published.
Arguably, this is the first story in world literature describing the making of a terrorist, if one understands by terrorist somebody who wants to rectify social injustice by pressuring a government into action through the use of violence against the population. The overarching theme is raised already in the opening paragraph, very famous in the description of Kohlhaas as one of the most honourable as well as one of the most terrible men of his age. And this is a paradox that's underlined a few lines later, when it's stated that his sense of justice made him a thief and murderer. An excess of virtue leads to vice. So that poses the riddle for the reader. How can honour and a sense of justice lead to murder? And does Kleist's text arouse sympathy for the terrorist, or is the story suggesting that unbending idealism is terrible and should be rejected?
Well, there are a lot of questions there, I think, in that statement, and I think one of the fascinations about Kleist's story is precisely that it shows how complex psychological motivation is. What we need to think about before we can really address this question of is Kohlhaas a terrorist is to think a little bit about the background of Kohlhaas and how he's presented in the text before he becomes this radicalized figure. It's very striking, I think, that Kohlhaas is really a fully paid-up member of a kind of proto-bourgeois class. I mean, he is essentially a well-behaved businessman who makes a living trading horses, and he's totally dependent on the existence of a rule of law and order if he's to conduct his business successfully. And I don't think he's really any kind of proto-Marxist revolutionary in any shape or form. And I think in that context, it's very important to note that, unlike most terrorists, he doesn't really want to overthrow the prevailing political structures. Indeed, I would argue it's quite the contrary. He wants really to restore the old structures to their former health. And his willingness to accept the punishment of death at the end of the story is a ringing endorsement of the status quo that was in existence prior to this invasion of his rights.
It's true that Kohlhaas wants to restore a political system rather than abolish it or change it even. But nevertheless, in spite of his intentions, his actions have the effect of unhinging the government. And also he does kill a large number of innocent people in order to achieve this political aim. So I would say that does make him a terrorist, though not a Marxist one.
You're quite right to point out that it's certainly true that he really does resort to some very extreme measures indeed. But I think there are two aspects here. I think there's a psychological aspect. I mean, I think that what Kleist is really trying to do here is to explore some of the social and psychological mechanisms that prompt such extreme behaviour. And in that context, I'd come back to this point, how ordinary, really, Kohlhaas is. I mean,
but that is, of course, exactly why it's such a fascinating story about the making of a terrorist. And we've got that time and again in Baader-Meinhof. It's the idealists who, from idealism, can turn into violence.
You can condemn this kind of violence. The problem is, of course, once it's unleashed this violence, it's very, very difficult to stop. And I would see the story as perhaps advocating a position of what can we do to prevent this kind of violence from being unleashed in the first place. And I think here what Kleist's story shows is that when human beings suffer such an obvious injustice and find that there's no prospect of their ever obtaining justice, they're really at grave risk of being radicalised because they no longer really have any faith in the judiciary and the prevailing structures of law and order. And I think, of course, as we all know, once individuals feel that they've got nothing left to lose, that risk of radicalisation is increased yet further. I think it's interesting to know, it's a very interesting point in the story when Kohlhaas speaks with Luther, and Luther asks him, do you not perhaps regret having embarked on this violent quest for justice? And I think Kohlhaas' answer is very telling here. He says, maybe or maybe not, he says. If I had known that it would take the heart's blood of my beloved wife, I might have done as your reverence suggests, and not made a fuss of a bushel of oats. But now they have come to cost me so dear, I think the matter should take its course. And that demonstrates, I think, that for Kohlhaas, the turning point of the story really is the death of his wife, Lisbeth.
The story is fantastic in portraying how somebody is made into a terrorist and to awaken sympathy, because Kohlhaas takes such a long time before he takes any action, and as you've outlined, the personal cost in all this involved. So the reader is at that point quite sympathetic towards Kohlhaas. But then, as so often happens with Kleist, things take a momentum of their own, and once he starts being violent, it develops, snowballs quite out of proportion, and at one point he styles himself as the emissary of the Archangel Michael, and he gives a writ which he claims is given at the castle of Lützen, the provisional world government. And the narrator then says there's some madness in there, and there's more and more criticism as Kohlhaas then develops this violence, getting from a handful of men to over 100, and burning down towns, killing people who have nothing to do with it. So there's the other side of the story too, the criticism of an idealist turned radical. So seeking justice and the empathy created for that is one side of the story, but on the other hand, revenge and hubris are among the less appealing aspects of Kohlhaas, aren't they?
Oh, I would agree. And of course the dividing line between justice and revenge is always thin. But it is there, I think, and Kleist upholds that division. And of course just how interconnected justice and revenge are is suggested by the English term retribution, a term that hovers somewhere between justice and revenge. For me, of course, the term justice usually implies that punishment is administered by a neutral agency, like a court, whereas in the case of revenge, the punishment has a much more personal element and is usually administered by the party who has been wronged. And, of course, Kohlhaas wants the Junker in person to restore his horses back to their health. There is no doubt, I think, that, at least to begin with, Kohlhaas in his rage is certainly out for revenge, and he's determined that the Junker should personally restore his horses to health, and in a clear act of hubris, he even goes as far as to argue that it's his right to exact revenge on his enemy, when he tells Luther that even the Lord did not forgive all his enemies. And of course this unwillingness to forgive the Junker means that he cannot receive communion, something that, as a devout Christian, he takes very seriously. But I think at the end of the story, this personalised aspect of revenge, for me, subsides, because at the end of the story he does receive communion, albeit from Luther's emissary Jakob Freising. In this way, I think that Kleist signals that Kohlhaas's quest for justice cannot simply be dismissed as a misguided act of personalised revenge. But I think the fact that this original act does stem from a desire for revenge also underlines the truth of Aristotle's observation in the Nicomachean Ethics that reason of its own moves nothing, and very little, I think, happens in human affairs without some form of personal, emotional investment.
I think that is the crux of the story, that his quest for justice is justified, and nevertheless the way he goes about it is wrong. And I think that's where Kleist is in this conundrum, and in order to even things out, he puts in the gypsy figure. There's been a lot of criticism that in a story that is so realistic, so detailed, he has this romanticized figure of a gypsy who can foretell the future. But this gypsy figure is the one who mediates between the good and the bad in Kohlhaas. And of course he has killed a lot of innocent people, and that can't go unpunished, although why he did it is understandable and has to be punished. So Kleist then puts that into history by having the bad ruler of Saxony. The reader would, of course, at the time have known what happened to Saxony from the 16th century to Kleist's time, the demise of Saxony. And the gypsy, foretelling that demise, tells somebody who did something bad is ultimately punished by history, and Kohlhaas's children, they thrive and go up in the world. So the good that Kohlhaas did is sort of with his children, but he has to pay the ultimate price.
Oh, absolutely. And although many critics, Lukács in particular, hated this inclusion of the gypsy episode, I think it's actually a masterstroke in the story, because it adds a completely new dimension. But I think also structurally it gives Kohlhaas a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card at the end of the story, because he could play this and save his life, and of course he chooses not to do so.
But that also is interesting on a psychological level, because instead of using it as get out of jail free, he uses it for yet another act of final retribution, swallowing the capsule, looking the Elector of Saxony in the eye, and him fainting. In the very moment of his execution, he's got the last power over his adversary.
And I think it's very interesting that you used the word retribution there and not the word revenge, because I think, again, many people have seen that as an act of revenge, and I don't really see it as an act of revenge, but I do see it, like you, as a kind of punishment. And I also see it as a demonstration of I value things and principles higher than my life. I could have saved my life by selling you this capsule, but I chose not to do it. And that's also a kind of lesson as well, I think, for the Elector of Saxony.
But you also have to remember what the gypsy said. He said to the gypsy principle, the gypsy said, and the life of your children. And he puts his principle above caring for his children.
Well, I would see it slightly differently. I think that in following those principles, he actually ensures their future. And that's what
he does in an abstract way, but they have lost both their parents, their future is financially secured, and they have him as a model there. But it's putting the principle above the living human being.
Well, all human beings die in the end, and we all have to live without our parents, and what Kohlhaas secures for them is, I think, a secure legal basis for them to continue their lives. But I think that's just an example of how these details of the story can divide people in all sorts of different ways, and the fascination of that ending.
And ultimately, I think one of the functions of the story is to warn governments to govern wisely and justly, and to warn, and with an eye to the French Revolution that's just happened, if you let injustice rule, then there is an uprising. So a good government, a reform government, can prevent violent revolution, or should prevent. So it's an argument for better government.
That there for me is the contrast between the Elector of Saxony and the Elector of Brandenburg, because under the rule of the Elector of Saxony, standards of justice have been allowed to decline to the point that even a well-behaved, obedient citizen like Kohlhaas feels compelled to resort to force in order to secure justice. And of course, you could argue that the Elector of Saxony is hardly an evil man, but perhaps only a weak man, whose character is most clearly reflected, I think, in that remark, "Folly you rule the world, and your throne is a pretty woman's lips." But of course, weakness itself is, I think, very problematic here. What also I think is very striking, especially for the rulers of the time, is how easy it is really for Kohlhaas to shake this state to its very foundations. I mean, with very few men, suddenly there is this huge crisis. And I think here this story must have been read in the context of the French Revolution, and, as you say, and do we want this to happen here?
Yes, very much so. And if you think of the philosophers who prepared the French Revolution, I mean, not knowingly, but sort of in effect, Rousseau, he actually argued for the right to resistance if the ruler broke the social contract. And so you can see in this story set in the 16th century, it very much discusses issues of the time after the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, especially after the Terror, where you've got this connection between virtue in excess leads to vice, Robespierre. That led a lot of people to think, how can we prevent such a thing? And the argument was very much the government must reform, the government must be just, must listen to the people, or the consequences would be absolutely dire.
And I think here we come back to this essential stance of Kohlhaas, that he doesn't want to revolutionise his society, he wants it to be restored to a state of health. And here I think we might also see the story in connection with the Prussian reform movement, because around 1806, 1807, this sort of period, you've got men like Stein and Hardenberg and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, all men with whom Kleist, I think, was quite closely associated and I think supported, basically, who embarked on a process of reform in the former states of the Holy Roman Empire and saw really that a process of modernisation and improvement was inevitable, especially if they were to avoid the kind of consequences that have been seen over the border. A third figure who Kohlhaas encounters is, of course, famously Martin Luther, who intervenes in affairs in an attempt to dissuade Kohlhaas from his violent course and to force him back into the confines of human order. Maybe, Ricardo, you could say a little bit about the presentation of Luther in the text, because he does play quite a major role, and of course he expects to find a devil in Kohlhaas, but he does find somebody with whom he can actually have a rational discourse.
He does, but the interesting thing, first of all, is that Kohlhaas and his wife are committed Lutherans, a new religion at the time, so it's very recent that Luther reformed the church. The story is set in the middle of the 16th century, so Luther's still alive, the Reformation just a few decades old. And Luther, famous for having challenged church authorities, in his thinking, direct relationship to God, just ousting all other authorities. And that is what Kohlhaas adopts, this direct relationship to God without anybody else. But on the other hand, Luther is also famous for being politically very submissive to authorities. He challenges church authorities, but not political authority in the country. You should obey your Landesherr, is Luther's take. And that's of course what he does do in this story. He is the one who says to Kohlhaas that the ruler doesn't know of Kohlhaas's case, and that's the argument by which he gets Kohlhaas finally on board, and Kohlhaas then submits his case to the ruler. And of course it's a lie. It's the age-old story that you know, if only your ruler knew, then he would do justice. We know, of course, that this ruler isn't like that. But the Luther in this story is politically conservative, and that is very aptly captured here by Kleist.
I think it's striking that we've spent a lot of time talking about wickedness, violence, justice, the pursuit of idealism. But one thing I think we mustn't lose sight of in this story is that it is very funny in parts. There are moments of great humour, I think, in the text.
Yes, and great earthiness. Kleist has this amazing range between the most abstract in philosophical terms and the most concrete. And the scene I find most humorous is when the horses are brought to the marketplace by a knacker, and Kleist and the relevant aristocracy are cited to come and view them and to verify are they these horses or not. And you can just imagine this confrontation, these airy-fairy aristocrats, the idealist, strong Kohlhaas, and then this knacker. The knacker, he couldn't be just more disrespectful. He pees in public in front of all these people, and the way Kleist describes it is just absolutely hilarious, and everybody is appalled that these noble people have to witness such uncouth acts in public. And while it's very funny, I also find it fascinating because it's one of these Kleistian turning points of contingency, because while previously the population was on Kohlhaas' side, that scene, that humiliation by the knacker of the aristocracy by behaving in this disrespectful, animal-like way, that turns the mood against Kohlhaas, and from then onwards his fate goes downwards. I find that is one of the brilliant ideas of Kleist, to show how something that was without outside anybody's control can have such devastating, lasting effects, and do that in such a funny way.
Absolutely. Something that's very striking about this story is that it's prompted a number of adaptations in the 20th century. All sorts of filmmakers and authors have come to this story and used it as a kind of basis for a new text. I mean, there are over 100 adaptations, I think, in the 20th century of this story, and some of the best known, of course, are E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, which sets the story in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, with an Afro-American jazz pianist called Kohlhaas, who's taunted by Irish immigrants in America. Schlöndorff famously made another film called A Man on Horseback. And of course there's The Jack Bull, which sets the story in late 19th century Wyoming. None of these adaptations is really very successful, and in particular I would say that none of them really manages, for example, to engage with that element of humour that you've just pointed out. It shows how difficult it is, actually, I think, to adapt these prose works of Kleist for the stage and screen, and I think, as we've shown in our discussion, they have a degree of complexity, I think, that is very, very difficult to bring across in that format.
Yes, and at the same time they are complex but absolutely gripping, and I can only invite everybody to read the stories. Thank you very much, Sean, for this discussion, and goodbye for now.